Hello everyone, Alan Sens here, and welcome to the last segment in the arms control section. This video is on the peace movements, and we'll be focusing in this video on the social organizations that really grew around the issue of nuclear weapons, nuclear war, nuclear testing, and peace advocacy more generally, both during the Cold War and today. So let's get started. Here are the learning objectives for this video. By the time we're done, you should be familiar with the anti-nuclear and peace movements of the past and the present, and you should be familiar with the motives and the goals of these movements. Now, just a quick note on what we're talking about here. We are talking about social movements, and whatever you want to call them, you can call them non-governmental organizations, you can call them peace movements, as I call them, or you can call them civil society actors, but basically what we're talking about here is groups of concerned citizens who have come together, organized, and embarked on efforts to try to raise awareness and change government policies surrounding nuclear weapons and nuclear arms control. Many of these movements are still very active today. We can't go through all of them, of course, so the ones I've selected here are really the ones that in my view, are the most famous or are worthy of mention. If I've left anyone out, I apologize, but obviously we could go on forever chronicling these movements, and that's not my purpose here. My purpose here really is just to introduce some of the basic themes and some examples for you to work with. Okay, so here's a good starting point, I think. The Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, very famous, was formed in the United Kingdom in 1957. Its main motive was to advocate for nuclear disarmament and for arms control treaties. Got quite big, as you can see, membership of over 350,000 people in the 1980s. Established stronger and stronger international links as the Cold War went on. And really, it's the movement that's been at the forefront of the general peace movement in the United Kingdom since this time. A special note about the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament comes in the form of the creation of this symbol. And this symbol, which is now a universal symbol for peace, was actually commissioned by the CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and was designed by Gerald Holtham in 1958. And basically the CND wanted a symbol to use for a peace march that could be a rallying point, an easily recognizable symbol of their principles and what they stood for. So what Holtham did is he took the semaphore signal flag notations for the letter C and the letter D, and he put them together, C right here and D right here, put them all in a circle, and you have the symbol designed by Holtham for the first Aldermaston Peace March against nuclear war, which was held in 1958. And the symbol obviously caught on and became used by peace movements in the United Kingdom, in North America, and the rest of Europe, and around the world. And now when we see that sign, we recognize it as the symbol for peace. Really quite remarkable, and it's a statement of the power of symbols in global politics. Here's another organization that I think is very important. Women's Strike for Peace was formed in the United States in 1961 by Bella Abzug and Dagmar Wilson. And in November of 1961, about 50,000 women were brought together by the Women's Strike for Peace, and they marched in about 60 cities in the United States to demonstrate against nuclear weapons. It was in fact the largest national women's peace protest of the 20th century. And it had some influence. It helped push the United States into signing the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963. The nuclear freeze movement is very interesting. It was formed in 1980 by a peace researcher named Randall Caroline Forsberg. The goal was just as the title sounds, a freeze. And essentially what the idea was is for everyone just to please stop. Stop testing, stop producing, stop deploying nuclear weapons, missiles, new aircraft, just freeze. And the whole idea is that if everyone would just freeze, stop, then there could be discussions of building down, of reducing armaments, of introducing arms control. The idea was that in the frenzy of the arms race, arms control and disarmament wasn't going to get anywhere because everyone was preoccupied with building. So the idea of the freeze was to create this pause that would enable arms control and disarmament agreements to be negotiated and to be signed. It actually had a very prominent profile. It was the subject of a huge rally at the United Nations in New York in the United States. And on June 12th, 1982, that rally took place in Central Park, and it was the largest rally in the history of the United States. It brought about 1 million people to Central Park in June of 1982 to protest against nuclear weapons. It was also briefly a subject in a presidential race, the 1984 race for the Democratic presidential nomination. Local Freeze and other anti-war groups placed the freeze question on a large number of November election ballots, where it passed by overwhelming majorities. And so this sign here on this graphic, vote November 6th, make the freeze the issue, was getting voters and encouraging voters to vote for pro-freeze candidates. Now, the fate of it wasn't very positive, although the Democratic nomination for President, Walter Mondale, won largely because he claimed to support the freeze. In the presidential campaign against Ronald Reagan, he actually turned out to say things that were even more Cold War-ish, hawkish, and militaristic than Reagan did. And many say that his failure to actually live up to his commitment to the freeze may have actually contributed to his defeat to Reagan in that election. How can we not talk about this one? This is Greenpeace, founded as the Don't Make a Wave Committee in 1969, 1970 in Kitsilano, Vancouver. First offices, by the way, were at Cypress and West Broadway in Kitsilano, so very local. And obviously this group later expanded its interest into the environmental movement that it is today, but it really got started with an opposition to U.S. nuclear tests off the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, and the French nuclear tests later that were conducted in the Pacific. So that's how Greenpeace got started. It got started as an anti-nuclear test movement. Here's a well-known one, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. It was founded in 1980 by physicians both in the United States and the USSR. Since then, now it is a federation of national medical groups in over 63 countries. And the common goal is to create a more peaceful and secure world free from the threat of nuclear war, and to inform the public and policymakers of the effect of nuclear weapons and nuclear war. They use as the basis for this the principle of the medical profession, that doctors have an obligation to prevent what they cannot treat. And so doctors working for this organization sound the medical warning to humanity that nuclear war would be ultimately sort of the final epidemic, that there is no cure and there's no meaningful medical response to a nuclear war. Another initiative and movement was the nuclear weapons free zone movement. This is interesting. The chart here shows all the current nuclear free zones in the world today. Now, these are the major international ones. There are local ones, of course, put on by towns and cities and so on. But these are the big international ones. And the whole idea is to create these geographic parts of the world where nuclear weapons are not allowed to be stored, they're not allowed to be deployed, and they're not allowed to transit through. Now, of course, in principle, some of these zones are violated all the time, but the understanding is that these zones are in areas where countries have committed to not possessing nuclear weapons and don't want them in their territory. On the map on the left, all of the nuclear-free zones of the world are in blue. So it's actually fairly expansive territory, and it's not like nuclear weapons have never sailed through, past, or flown over some of these countries under certain circumstances. But for the most part, they are nuclear-free. And so the idea here is that if we keep expanding this zone, eventually the entire world might become a nuclear weapons-free zone movement. Obviously, there will be challenges with respect to countries that possess nuclear weapons, and ultimately we would need disarmament to achieve this. But this movement has been pushing this idea for a very long time, and as you can see, they've gotten results. Now today, there's a number of additional campaigns underway. Here's one example, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. This is about abolition completely. It was formed by International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War in 2007, and the whole idea is to pressure government to negotiate a treaty banning nuclear weapons. It's a very large group. There's 270 partner organizations in 60 countries around the world right now. Here's an interesting group. This is the Nuclear Security Project. I'm not sure what you might make of this. It was formed in 2007 by none other than Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Sam Nunn, and William Perry. For those of you not familiar with at least some of these names, these are iconic Cold Warriors of the Cold War period. These were prominent officials in the US government who at one point or another were all part of the defense establishment, all part of the US government's defense and military infrastructure and governance and leadership. And basically these four men came together with a professed goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. And they outlined their vision in a series of Wall Street Journal op-eds, and in fact were featured in a documentary film called The Nuclear Tipping Point, or I think it might be just Nuclear Tipping Point. It's worth seeing. I guess critics would say, well, why are you doing this now? Why didn't you work more strongly for a world free of nuclear weapons while you were actually in government? But I guess in their defense, one might say better late than never, and that with their experience and sort of the credibility of having been such a big part of this during the Cold War, maybe they now speak with a stronger voice than they might have otherwise. Another idea is this one, Global Zero, formed in 2008, and their whole idea is to phase the reduction of nuclear arsenals, to step down in steps, with the ultimate goal of reaching nuclear disarmament in the year 2030. I'll leave it to you to follow up. They've got a pretty good website, and I guess the question for you is, do you think this is feasible? Do you think this is possible to achieve by 2030? Okay, so by now you should be familiar with some of the anti-nuclear and peace movements of the past and present, and I hope now you feel familiar with their general motives and their goals of these movements. Okay, so those are just some movements I emphasize. There's a lot more out there, but those I think are the most prominent ones, and certainly ones that have received the most attention over time. I guess the big question for these movements is, can they be ultimately successful in achieving some of these goals? It's been a challenge for them to have the vast majority of the public support their specific objectives. It's been a challenge for them in terms of getting their policies and their ideas into government as part of government proposals and government ideas. So I think it's a fair question to ask, are they always condemned to being on the margins of the debate, or is it possible now that they will become more and more significant as their ideas become more and more embraced by populations around the world who in turn pressure governments for change? I think that's one of the great unanswered questions of peace movements today, as it was during the Cold War. But I think maybe after the Cold War there might be more of an opportunity for these groups because the Cold War is now over, and although there's clearly many hostilities and suspicions and threats in the world today, perhaps today in a post-Cold War setting we've got a better opportunity now than ever to work towards a nuclear-free world, or a world free of nuclear tests, or a world free of the possibility or prospect of nuclear war. I hope you enjoyed this sequence of videos. We'll see you soon.